to what degree do our attitudes about death and dying affect the way we live? I mean, before we're actually in those final stages, but for a 30-year-old in good health, a 50-year-old in good health, if you are, thinking a lot about death, are you actually going to live differently because of that?
I don't think so.
I do.
I don't think so. If one of the interesting things, you talk to a lot of people who've had near-death experiences, and quite a lot of them are very keen to get into the hospice and palliative care movement, and they think that if people only knew that there was an afterlife, it would make a difference. Well, for most of human history, they believed in an afterlife, and I can't think of a war that it's prevented, and I know that's a negative. It's a bit like saying, I can't think of an absence that I can remember. But nevertheless, no country that I can think of, no historical group I can think of has killed less because of religion.
But it doesn't necessarily turn on the question of are you going to be less violent. It's do you approach life differently in some way if death is more foregrounded in your consciousness?
Anyway, you believe it does?
I think it does. With the reports of people who've had near-death experiences, their life after the experience, not the belief in afterlife, but having seen their death and having seen the other side and come back, most of them report a keener sense of altruism and contribution and making different decisions. Most of them, their lives have changed.
Okay, so that's a very specific kind of case. I mean, people who've had these very dramatic near-death experiences.
So it's an experience rather than a belief.
Right, so then the question is, I mean, what if we do what you were talking about earlier, having these conversations about death? I mean, do you live differently if you do that?
Well, I think you do.
I think you do. Yeah. I mean, I participate with people who are dying. I'm not afraid of dying. I lean into death. I see it as an opportunity to serve as opposed to pulling away from it and not touching it. I think my life is very different as a result.
I used to run groups for people who had advanced malignancy. And they would come for 8 weeks, and we would... they would have readings that they would have to do that were about their own health, and they would have other readings about the social adjustments and social troubles that were reported in the literature. And then there was a section for 2 or 3 weeks where they had to talk about death and dying. And we evaluated these groups. And at the beginning, if you ask these people about the program, they would always say it's the death and dying stuff they don't like. They wish that wasn't in it. But it's a non-negotiable, so they have to do it. And then when they go through the program, that's the one they like the best. That was the one they got most out of. And it made a huge difference in, one, talking with family, preparing themselves psychologically, and preparing themselves socially. Many of them hadn't even made wills. And there was, particularly in an older group, there was a group of people who felt that making a will actually made it real, might bring it on. Well, actually, that was... The sting was taken out of that, and they were able to release and so it does change behaviour. Talking about death and dying does change behaviour, not only of people who are terminally ill, but most people. If you sit down and have conversations on a regular basis, you do alter your behaviour, and nearly all the evaluations of death education programs that we have in the United Kingdom and in Australia have shown that.
Well, it makes me wonder if every high school or every college should have a death studies program. Should that be a requirement?
Well, so I led a death studies program at George Mason University with graduate students, and I didn't care about the final exam with dates and theorists' names. The final exam was for them to identify what I would ask them, what is your greatest fear about dying? And for instance, one young man who was 26 said, my greatest fear is that I will one day be married and have children, and my parents will be dead. And my greatest fear is that my children will not know their grandparents or their values. And I said, what are you going to do about it? So always, what are you going to do about that fear? And I'm encouraging them to lean into their fear and make it different. And so he recorded, he videotaped his parents and asked them questions about, what do you want your non-existent grandchildren to know? Another young woman, her greatest fear about dying was that she was an only child, and she knew that it would be up to her to write the obituary and eulogy for her parents. I said, what are you going to do about that fear? And so she flew home to interview her father and said, as I did to mine, let's write your obituary together. And it didn't surprise me that a year later I got a wonderful letter from her saying, thank you so much for, making me do this, because in fact my father did die, and I was prepared and I was grateful, and it made a difference. So how will you lean in to your greatest fear? How will you make it different? You can do that, and then you won't have that same death anxiety. You won't pull back. You can all do that. What is your greatest fear about death or dying?
Yeah, I think death education is like health education. Good death education addresses the concerns around the troubles that you can prevent, and the things you can't prevent, you can harm reduce. A bit like wearing a seatbelt. Not wearing a seatbelt, the chances are very high that you'll be decapitated in an accident. Mm-hmm. Wearing a seatbelt, there's a high chance you'll lose your spleen. Mm-hmm. Better lose your spleen. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You don't fare so well without a head. Death education is a bit like that. It doesn't make you, you don't lose all your fear. Mm-hmm. You're not a new person, but you're better off with it than without it. Mm-hmm.